They will measure their levels of physical violence with black levels of physical violence. And as I said, they run a statistical game. And they'll often get away with it because people associate violence with physical interaction. You see, so we talk about violence and automatically we think of murder, killing, physical attacks and assault and so forth. But you see, when you're in power, there's another form of violence available to you. And when you're in power, you can call it by other names because power gives you the right also to define. And the power to define manipulates people's consciousness and blinds them to reality. And therefore, the ruling classes can appear to be even effeminate, nonviolent types. Wouldn't hurt a fly, but are yet the most violent people around. Because we cannot discount psychic violence. The violence against a person's mind. The violence against a person's perception of who he or she is. The violence that occurs from depriving a person of wholesome and healthy experiences that motivate and that provide the foundations for their healthy mental, social development as persons. Violence that motivates self-hatred. Violence that motivates alienation from the self and from the other. Violence that destroys initiative, that destroys persistence, that destroys the capacity of a community to organize itself socially and politically to act in its own interests. Violence that motivates many people then to engage in the self-destructive acts of drug addiction and other addictive forms of behavior. This is the most utter and the deepest violence of all. For often people can survive and respond and bounce back from physical violence. But the violence done to minds from the very first days of birth and from the very first years of life are extremely difficult to change. As a psychologist, as a person engaged in therapy, you come right up against the fact that it's usually those first 2, 3, 4, 5 years that are still working in a distorted personality. Those first 3, 4, 5 years that have driven a person insane, made them neurotic and maladjusted. And sometimes it takes almost another 3 or 4 or 5 years to even begin to get them on the path to healthy adjustment and behavior. A type of violence that breeds violence in itself and makes it appear that violence is self-initiated. And it's the type of violence you see that whites have visited on blacks so that they can stand back and say, we are not hurting them, we are not killing them, they're doing it to themselves because they've hidden the foundational violence, and that is the violence against the black consciousness and the black mind in such a way then that it expresses itself as black on black violence. This is the violence that comes, as we talked about earlier, from projecting black people as the major problem in this society. And this type of violence creates a sense of vulnerability and insecurity, a sense of dread and a sense of threat. It is this kind of violence that makes us wonder as black people if we are not slated for genocide. It creates then in us a state of mind, an offended sense of justice, an offended sense of self-image, self-esteem, self-confidence, a sense of powerlessness, a sense of incompetence, a sense of the inability to influence and control our environment, a sense of not being respected, a sense of social and self-alienation. And it is then the coming together of this state of mind with the material and other conditions I've enumerated earlier. This underlying anger and this underlying frustration, this underlying and chronic sense of self dissatisfaction and dissatisfaction about the whole state of the country and of the world, that a seemingly small event in the eyesight of whites, the rendering of an obviously unjust decision, serves as a spark that leads to an explosion. But they take us as fools. They think that we have not registered all of the prior injustices. They take us to think that we have a memory that does not include those injustices, and one that says, you must stop here, and we're not going to let you go any further. We are going to end the injustices that you have been visiting upon us. These people think that they have set up a system of domination wherein they can hide their injustices. Except that domination itself is an injustice.